Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across Australia and the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope, enable leadership and achieve their shared purpose. And when I say in 2021, we're still doing it in 2020 as well, for what's left of it. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. This week we're not actually going to Cambodia, but we're going to be talking about Cambodia. We're actually going to France, and we're going to be speaking to Ed Shuttleworth, who is the CEO of a charitable organisation that is based in Cambodia called SeeBeyondBorders, and their mission is to help children in Cambodia get to school whilst at the same time improving the teaching and learning that happens there. Ed and his wife, Kate Shuttleworth, set up this charitable organisation a number of years ago, and they've been doing some great work. And we've got Ed on today to talk about that great work and the challenges they face in Cambodia. And I know that we have a number of our listeners that have over the years worked in Cambodia. So I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on the experiences that the guys at SeeBeyondBorders have faced over the years, trying to bring about progressive change in an interesting part of the world. Don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon and Stitcher. And if you use Apple Podcast, please leave us a rating and give us a review. And for all the updates about the podcast, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a glorious sunny morning here in Melbourne, Friday morning, and joining me on the line from a delightful little village in the south of France is the CEO of SeeBeyondBorders, Ed Shuttleworth. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Stephen, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you and to picture myself back in Australia where it's warm. Compared to what it's like here at the moment.
I know, and primarily today we're going to talk about the great work that your organisation is doing in Cambodia, but obviously you're in France at the moment. I'm a Melburnian. A lot of the Melburnians listening to this podcast are starting to come out of our imposed hibernation because of COVID, and the weather's starting to turn, so we're all feeling a little bit more happy about life. But you're in Europe, and it's a different experience there. And for the folks here in Australia that aren't completely aware of what's going on in terms of COVID and a sort of resumption of restrictions, what's your experience where you are in France?
Well, I mean, we were in Europe. We actually were taking a group from the Ministry of Education in Cambodia to Ireland when lockdown first started in Europe back in March. And rather than go back to Cambodia, we isolated with our daughter who lives in the UK, and they put up with us for about 3 months. And we were very lucky where we were in kind of rural area where we could go out for a walk and those kind of things. Got used to living life on Zoom and the equivalent. But then things were relaxed, and really the only place we've had a house in France in a little village for quite a few years has been a bolt hole occasionally for us, and we decided to come here because key part of our income is what we can let our house out for in Australia. So getting back there was never an option. And I think that there's really been, particularly in this second lockdown that started with a sort of rolling area by area lockdowns and then became national lockdowns in much of Europe. Started a month, 6 weeks ago. There's really is a high level of anxiety around In this village, there's predominantly older people who live here. And during the summer, there were lots of people who were kind of getting out of the earlier lockdown and just coming and partying in this part of southwestern France. And their legacy has been left behind. And this particular area was relatively unscathed in the spring and early summer. But now there's a number of 80-year-olds, we understand, who are in hospital in quite a severe state. And this is only a small village, quite a number of people with COVID in their houses. And those of us, Kate and my wife Kate and I are not quite in the most vulnerable age bracket, but we're approaching that level. And many of the people we know who live here similarly at that kind of end of our lives. And yes, there's a high level of anxiety. People, going out with their masks all the time and taking a lot of care, just not leaving their houses if they possibly can. We're not allowed any further than 1 kilometre from our house to do any exercise. Of course, we can go to the shops, but we put that off for as long as we can from time to time. And all the pictures that we see on the news about what's happening in the hospitals, it looks really pretty grim. I've chipped my tooth, it's the worst thing that could happen. And I was told, the next available appointment was in March. So that's kind of, look, I'm thankful in many ways compared to what other people are having to put up with. But it's a very odd existence, you'd have to say, just kind of looking out of the window from time to time at empty streets and just really no one around. But the schools are open, so kids are going to school. When you do go out from time to time to try and get some exercise, people are out and about. But yeah, it feels like a very strange and oppressive atmosphere here at the moment. Yeah, it's not fun.
Last question on this before we actually move to the substantive topic of today's podcast. In the United States, COVID has become incredibly politicized by the outgoing administration. In Australia, there was some moments where it could have got like that, and there was, you could just sort of see that people, particularly some opposition parties, were trying to use it as political leverage against a particular government. But I think by and large you could say that it was a bipartisan approach in this country. What is your experience in France? Are there certain sections of the community based on their politics not embracing the seriousness of the virus, or is it just we know very well how much of a problem this is?
Yeah, I think that certainly, when the weather was nicer and it was warm, there was quite a reluctance of people to abide by the rules and the regulations. And my French isn't really good enough to follow the details of what's being reported on the news. But certainly, when I look at the English-speaking media and the English-speaking media in Britain, there is a sizable chunk of people whose livelihood comes from the entertainment industries of some sort or other, or the hospitality industry, and they're really suffering. And both Macron and Johnson, in respectively France and Britain, have introduced a number of measures where they possibly can to subsidise people in the hospitality industry. In town here, there's a number of people that we know who run accommodation during the summertime, and they've been given some level of compensation for the fact that they just haven't had the numbers, and many of them have had to be shut down. So that's definitely blunted in. There's much more conformism here than there would be, say, looking at the news in the States, where there appears to be, at any rate, real aggravation between those who want things to be opened up and those who don't. I think that because the numbers of deaths, where we in Britain close to 60,000 now, nothing like the total numbers that you see in the States, but nonetheless on a per capita basis, there'd be few families who don't know of somebody who's prematurely gone to their death as a consequence of it. And I think the media has been really effective at saying, you might not get it, but you might give it to somebody else, and your older relative, of which everybody has them. So that's really brought it home to people, and generally, I think, brought people in line. But I mean, for those whose livelihoods are in the theatre or musicians or things like that, they're doing it tough for sure. So.
Well, let's go to a part of the world where a lot of people have been doing it tough for a long, long time, and that is Cambodia and the work that you guys are doing amongst the education sector there. Just talk us through the backstory about how you came to be in Cambodia and setting up a charity that is, well, actually, I'll let you explain the charity as well, but just what's the backstory of See Beyond Borders?
Yeah, look, I guess it's a long story, but to try to keep it relatively short in a sense is that, like, I grew up, my family were in India when I was a child. My father was a tea planter, and we lived in kind of rural India, and I was sent to England to boarding school, and my family didn't leave until I was about 17 or so. So it's obviously a very strong part of my childhood. And I just happened to be working in Brisbane with a chap who said that he'd been visiting Cambodia and helping an organisation with building houses. And as I got talking to him, it resonated so much with me that I wanted my children, who were young at that stage, 7, 11, and 12, I think they were at that time, to go and have an experience of what life's like for the majority of people on this planet. And I managed to persuade Kate that it was a good idea. She started to look at the travel brochures, etc. And sort of about a week before we were due to get on the plane, said, "We're not going." I said, "It's too late now. We're committed." And we went, and we went to this was in 2002. So Cambodia is a very different place to what it is now. And we went down to the coast, sort of what's now quite a well-known holiday resort in Sihanoukville, and started working with an organisation to help sort of put together some really basic housing for people living kind of in a tidal area around the port. And families had kind of moved there to prostitute their children. And they were prostituting their 12-year-olds to the sailors. And it was just something that was incredibly hard to take, especially, with our own children there as well. I mean, fortunately, I had no idea what was going on, although they were curious as to why the other kids didn't particularly want to play with them, kind of thing. So I just hit us really, really hard. And, for a long time, we kind of volunteered to try to help this organisation that we came with originally grow in Australia and support things, and really kind of always had a bit of an eye as to what could we possibly do that would, I guess, just try and give those parents a bit more of a choice about how to raise their families. And that got us started and thinking that way. And I guess I probably bored a lot of people with that kind of story, but I just so happened to run into a guy who had just sold his business, and one day he just said, how about coming and having a cup of coffee with me at home? And he said, look, if I give you money towards setting up your operational costs, will you start an organisation and put into practice what you've talked to me about? And I mean, that was quite confronting. It's kind of easy to say, oh, yes, I'm going to go and set up a charity in Cambodia. But when somebody says, okay, right, are you really going to do it now? But I guess, never wanted to die wondering, and managed to persuade Kate that this was a good idea. And really at that stage, we didn't really know exactly what we were going to do. Fortunately, through the other charity, we'd met a number of organizations in Cambodia, and we're able to go and say, what will help? And Kate's a teacher, and they all said, look, the education system's in a dreadful state. Can you come and help the teachers do something useful in their classrooms? And that's where we started. We started just by bringing in some Australian teachers to run training programs for Cambodian teachers. And probably the key things after the first teaching set of workshops we ran in Cambodia, we went to visit the schools to see what was happening and realized, nothing changed. There's really no different to what it had been like before. We kind of said to the teachers, didn't you enjoy coming to the workshops and didn't you learn anything that we taught? And that bag of resources that you've got hanging there at the back of your classroom that you used used when you were on the program, don't you use those with the kids? And they all just laughed and said, we had a great time. We loved coming and watching the Australians and learning about what you do in Australia, but it's not relevant in our classes here in Cambodia. And that was just a real body blow at that stage. And we just thought all of that kind of Western self-gratification that you're looking for when you go and work in these places that says, oh, congratulations, you guys are doing such a good job, kind of changed our lives. Oh, well, absolutely not a bit of it, And I think that it was such an important lesson to learn really early on in the process and really got us to look at the whole situation there through a completely different prism. And we just, then sort of said, well, what is going to work? What is possible? And we were really lucky in terms of we met some people who were actually pulling out from an organisation, a Belgian organisation, who, they'd spent 20 million euros trying to improve teacher quality in Cambodia, and they were able to give us a really good list of do's and don'ts, both their Cambodian and their foreign staff, and that really got us on the right track, I suppose.
For context, for our listeners that aren't completely aware of the situation in Cambodia, let's start with education. And I assume that, my knowledge of Cambodia extends to, the killing fields, and a lot of my friends go there for cheap holidays, and that's pretty much about it, so I apologise. But I have had some friends that have gone over, who will be listening to this show, that have gone over and done charity work in Cambodia for a period of time. And I've heard anecdotally through them some of their experiences. Just tell us about what Cambodia was like when you first arrived. Obviously, I assume you can't talk about Cambodia without talking about the impacts that the Khmer Rouge had, and as they tried to move out of that, from a government standpoint, and from a societal standpoint, where is Cambodia heading, and why were, for example, these teachers having problems? And what are the challenges that teachers face in Cambodia that are distinctly different to the experiences for teachers here in Australia? So
2002, when we first got there, like many of the streets in Phnom Penh were still dirt roads at that stage. There was two kind of multi-story buildings really above about like 4 floors, I suppose, was the kind of average height that's there. I don't know, probably many more people will have been to Phnom Penh and possibly to Siem Reap and seen just a massive transformation in those cities in that time. Phnom Penh resembles almost like a mini KL or Singapore, or probably not quite Singapore, but certainly it's a little city that's sort of typically Asian, really quite comfortable to live in. There's lots of coffee shops, branded coffee shops on every corner. There's 100 different types of food and places to go and eat. So just a massive transformation in that time. Cambodia has sustained like an 8% GDP growth per annum for a good number of years, one of the highest in the world, really, but often incredibly low base. But that transformation in the cities does not translate to the rural areas at all. And I've obviously got to be careful what I kind of say about the government and make sure that I fairly reflect both sides of that. But the Prime Minister's been in power since basically 1993. And continues to run the country that's ostensibly a democracy. The leading oppositional party was banned prior to the previous election, and you can imagine what the outcome would be under those circumstances.
That makes it tough.
Yes, it makes it tough. The Minister for Education is an extremely good guy. He's an economist by background and has held a number of different posts through the government. He has a genuine heart for really wanting to change education, and is having to battle factions within the Ministry of Education who've got very different ideas about what the education system needs to look like in the future. Culturally, Cambodians are very kind of homogeneous, I suppose, in a way. It's very much a groupthink type of approach to things, and the leader is typically listened to without question about what they want to do, which is actually very hard for leaders because they don't always know all the answers, and it's very difficult for them to ask and discuss, well, what do you think? And that style of leadership has taken a long time to cut through with the Cambodian team that we have in Cambodia. And we've had many teachers say, when we've asked them what they think, sort of sit and look blankly and say, nobody's ever asked us that question before. So those kind of challenges, and people just expect to do as they're told. And those who are doing the telling, cast around a lot of the times and thinking, what am I going to tell them? And therefore you've got a very curious interaction between kind of Western development specialists and government educational experts. The education in Cambodia is simply been at appalling levels, really. I mean, it's amongst the worst in the world. Even now, average Cambodian's has got about 4.7 years of education compared to Australians have 13 years, even excluding higher education. Recent statistics suggest that when it comes to completing grade 10, you've only got about 11% of the population that gets through to that kind of level. And that's even compared to sort of with Vietnam and Thailand, you have way more than that in their success rate. And statistics put out by the government in 2018 identified that of 15-year-olds that are in education, still in education, there are about 26% of 15-year-olds in education, not necessarily grade 9 where you'd expect them to be. Many of them may still be in grade 4, 5, and 6. But of them, only about 10% of them are reaching any form of minimum proficiency level. So if you extrapolate that over the whole of the 15-year-old population, you've got like 2.6% of people reaching a minimum proficiency level, a sub 3. There's a couple of countries in Africa that are actually marginally worse. I don't know how you get worse than 3%, but it's that kind of order of magnitude. So the problem is enormous. And the problem really starts at primary grades where children, by the time they reach grade 5 and 6, can't read. So they go on to lower secondary school, if they go on to lower secondary school, without the ability to read their textbooks or to be able to construct arguments or logical thinking or problem solving, any of those kind of key concepts that need to be taught right from the start of school. So kind of that paints a picture, I suppose, of where the country's at. Huge amount of income comes from tourism. There is obviously the garment factories, construction. There's now a little bit of manufacturing, some sort of bicycle parts and things like that get manufactured in Cambodia. But basically that's it. The country's kind of survived on extracting its natural resources. So many trees are cut down. It's basically flat, most of the country. So pockets of land get dug up so the relatively wealthy can live higher than their their poorer neighbours. So when it rains, the water goes to their neighbour's property rather than theirs. Not laughing, laughing out of a sense of hysteria, really. A very, very difficult environment to work in and make progress in. A lot of kind of political stepping over and around obstacles that are there.
So the experience of a child going through the education system in Cambodia, why is it that they are not staying in school, or why is it that they're moving into high school and they still don't have the ability to read? What's happening in the classroom?
Look, teacher education to be very, you've got to kind of remember that that the Khmer Rouge basically banned education. They shut all the schools, burnt the books, and education was outlawed. So really wasn't until the Vietnamese entered the country, in the late 70s, in 1979, that when they started to occupy the country, and they never occupied the whole country. There was a good chunk of the Thai border area in the west of the country that was kind of no man's land in the Khmer Rouge area, and remained so until kind of Pol Pot died in 1989. So it's really quite recent times. The Vietnamese started to try to get schools back up and running in kind of a basic form, but they were there as an occupying force. They weren't there kind of as a benevolent saviours. The country remained in civil war with lots of different factions fighting each other until the Vietnamese withdrew in the late 80s, early 90s, and then the UN came and oversaw some rather haphazard elections, which kind of pulled together the various strong men of the country at the time. And then in 93 there was an election, and it was a last-minute decision not to put the Khmer Rouge on the ballot. The Khmer Rouge had been on the ballot and had been supported by the West. I mean, particularly the British, who taught them how to lay landmines, because they were kind of that was where the real battle between Soviet Union and the West was really taking place. The Soviet Union backing the Vietnamese, and the Western countries trying to just back the insurgents that happened to be around at the time. So the education system really starts to begin to kind of move forward, not till the 1990s, really. So it's actually not very long to reconstruct the system from ground up. And of course, the major devastation was just lack of teachers, just no teachers. I mean, many teachers have been killed during the Khmer Rouge time, and you just hid any education that you might have for fear of being called out, of being of a kind of the ruling class. The Khmer Rouge celebrated the workers, and everybody was pushed to work in the fields and build these big sort of agricultural centres and irrigation systems, and many people died. 2 million died essentially during that period. So kind of the collective post-traumatic stress disorder, is still manifestly obvious in the country today. And if you're a child now, you're probably the second generation post Khmer Rouge time, but your parents will still be suffering the trauma of their parents of that time. You've got to hand it to the Ministry of Education that one thing that they have achieved is that in grade 1, which is to do five-year-olds, it's probably equivalent to kindy in Australia, or New South Wales at any rate. You've got nearly full enrolment in school at that stage now. There's schools everywhere. The problem isn't access to education. The problem is the quality of it. So you've got sort of 98% enrolment at that level, but you've lost nearly half the children by the time they go into grade 7. So by the time they go to lower secondary school, and then you've lost half of them by the time you get into high school. you have about 10% of the kids actually graduating from high school. And why don't they continue? Well, it's sort of a combination of the fact that, they become physically capable to do manual work, and they're needed by the families to support their income. And also, families reckon, if they're not reading and they're not learning anything at school, why leave them there? Because, that's a valuable asset in a sense, a valuable asset to the family. So they just drop out and just don't go. And many families also migrate to Thailand in particular, some to Malaysia or Vietnam to get work, or even move around the country. And very often children are left with grandparents or relatives who simply don't enforce, that they should attend school. And so they get behind and just don't continue. So extremely difficult for them. I mean, I just read you some of these statistics here that I was looking at earlier in the day that were put out by UNICEF earlier this year or the end of last year, and it's quite a powerful illustration of what it says here. 1 in 4 victims of mines explosives remaining after the war. The casualties were children. 1 in 2 children has experienced severe beating. 1 in 4 children has suffered emotional abuse. 1 in 20 girls and boys have been sexually assaulted. So, that's kind of the environment that these children, especially in the rural areas where we work, that's their background. That's what they're experiencing. The thought of going to school and learning something is probably not the first thing on their mind.
No, I can imagine. Well, actually, I can't imagine, but I can understand. So let's go back to that moment that you were speaking on earlier in the podcast when you were visiting some of the teachers that you had recently invited to a training with them with some of the Australian colleagues, and you noted that they weren't using some of the materials that you'd provided. And they sort of laughed at you and said, it was lovely to come and do that, but this is not how it works for us. So obviously that's a huge learning for you in your journey with the work that you want to do. What changes did you make then? And now maybe talk a bit more about the work that, SeeBeyondBorders is doing right now. Where are you having success, is I guess one.
Yeah. Our greatest challenge was okay, we're here, we're committed to doing this. We've really taken this kind of dramatic turn in our own futures and our families in that sense. The only thing we really want to come out of this is we want to do something that's worthwhile. It's going to actually make people's lives better. We never even started with the intention of starting a charity, and we didn't even intend to employ any staff from the very outset. We just wanted to kind of, feel that families didn't have to prostitute their children to survive. So we just dived headfirst into how we're going to improve the quality of teaching and what does work. And Kate really was obviously the driver on that because she had all of the classroom experience, albeit in a very different context. And really it was only by helping teachers in their classroom that we could achieve anything. And so really the core of what we wanted to do was to develop a mentoring program. So to train mentors to be able to work with the teachers in their classrooms so that, they could put into practice the stuff that we could teach them in the workshops. We still needed to do workshops because we didn't really just want to run a school or anything like that. That just didn't seem to be appropriate. We were looking for something that, had the chance to be transformative rather than just selective and then trying to, almost just really sort of take over a particular school or any of those kind of things. We were looking for a systemic solution. We struck on mentoring as being the method because indeed that was what this particular organisation had been doing that I mentioned to you before. And we devised a more cost-effective model of how we would do that. And we recruited our own staff, trained our own staff, and used, albeit a sort of a cascaded kind of method, which is definitely frowned on in the development circles. But we trained staff and we trained mentors to start with to go and work with teachers in their classroom. And then we developed scales for the teachers around the skills that they needed to do their work properly, and we started testing the children as to whether their scores were improving, and they improved really rapidly. We focused particularly on maths because obviously initially we had no understanding of the language to be able to work in literacy, and it's really only in the last 4 years that we've started working in literacy as well. So initially it was in maths, and we recognized, the problems weren't just that the teachers couldn't teach. It was all around the community and getting kids to come to school, getting kids to be engaged by school. So we did things like sport, we did some art, we did health programs, etc., just as a way to try and engage the kids and the community in the school and engage them in the importance of learning. But the core curriculum part to start with maths and mentoring, and that's what we actually won an award from UNESCO in 2016 for our program. It was amusing actually because when we got the email, I was a bit later into the office and they showed me the email and I said, oh yes, that's a wonderful bit of spam, isn't it? And it wasn't until I actually got a call from somebody that I knew in Phnom Penh saying, congratulations, you've won this award. The penny dropped, and one of the staff members came into the office the next day. We hadn't really told many people by that stage, and said, oh, wonderful news. I heard on the news that Cambodia has won an award from UNESCO for its education program. No mention of our organisation or anything like that. So, I mean, that really helped us as well, and we branched off into doing literacy. Again, that's a different story. And that started to give us an opportunity to say, look, we can prove that this change is possible, but we can't really make this happen without a sort of support at a systemic level, because teachers are not going to necessarily do what we ask them. They're going to do what the Ministry of Education is going to ask them to do. So we need to influence the whole process by which this works. If anything that we do is going to be sustainable beyond the time that we spend watching the teachers.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, Ed, is how have you managed to insert yourself into the education system processes without pissing off government?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a real challenge, and we've made a good number of mistakes with that process, forgetting that this doesn't work as a way in which a Western structure would work at all. And it's all a question of building the right alliances and giving face to the key influencing people, etc., to kind of make it work. So, after we won the award, we did get invited to quite a lot of ministry functions of one sort or other. Everybody was interested in what we were doing and how we were doing it. And frankly, looking back on it, I guess we were flattered, really, in a way that we should never have been. And we were kind of flattered and really thought, oh, yes, we can really achieve something at a systemic level. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And people just wanted to take the ideas and, run with them themselves in some shape or form, which, frankly, we wouldn't have minded, really, if it actually translated into something that was a real change in the system. But I guess two things that we can really take some credit for, I guess, if we're about taking credit, is that did become an increasing focus on those early grades in primary education as being the source of where all the problems really were in the education system. And also there is discussion about making mentoring a national program. So we have been able to do quite a lot of work with people around the mentoring program. But I think we've learned some really important lessons, and we did make some key contacts and connections, and we have been able to work with sectors of the ministry in a way that I think will, in the longer term, mean that some of these things that we're doing become embedded and can become practice. I mean, with COVID, obviously, a lot of our programming has had to be curtailed, but we're focusing on proving, we're focusing on, in the area which I call the laboratory, on proving methodologies and things that teachers can cope with and does change their teaching practice. And then we've got the other department, which is all about the distribution and making it more big scale, which is liaison with government, supporting research projects, trying to engage people from overseas in a systemic and a sort of a dynamic process that supports particular new methodologies that need to be brought into the teaching practice in a kind of a non-confrontational way. The last thing that we want to do is to suggest, well, you haven't been doing it like this, so everything that you've done in the past has been wrong. That's kind of one of the big pitfalls that we need to try to avoid. And building those relationships so that people don't feel threatened by change. That's hard. I mean, that is very hard.
The mentors that you've brought into your organisation, I'm assuming they're locals. Would that be right?
Yes. So they don't work for us. I mean, we have our own staff, but mentors are typically school principals, lead teachers, technical grade leaders, who have some capacity to go and work in other teachers' classrooms and help them out. I mean, it's often a particular challenge because there's no spare capacity in the system. You've got classes of 40, 50 kids at least, and more when you get into higher grades. So, if a teacher has to go and mentor another teacher, that means there's 40, 50 kids sitting there with nothing to do. So we've got to be quite innovative about how you provide work and those sort of things to make that possible. And we are starting what we call an educational leaders program now to try to train more people, not necessarily to be teachers, but to help with mentoring, because mentoring is about training adults, whereas teaching is obviously teaching the kids. Of course, you've got to have some exposure with that, but some of the skills are different to get. So we're trying to develop these educational leaders who will in turn work with groups of mentors, and even then provide some resource to allow mentors to go and work with other teachers so classes can be taken care of, etc., while they're away. Because that capacity thing is another barrier to getting professionals to work side by side and work together on their teaching practice. It's a very, very difficult thing to do when you're completely isolated in front of 40 or 50 kids. It's a challenge for them.
Being a charity, I can only imagine the challenges that you have with the philanthropic component of your work. I've just noticed in my research that you've got partnerships with Australian Aid and the Charity Commission for England and Wales and Realtas Naheran, the Irish government's aid program. Talk us through some of the work that you've had to do externally outside of Cambodia to get people to support the good work that you are doing at a local level.
Yeah, finding funding is really difficult. It's the work that we do is not kind of readily understood by people. Australians are fantastic at helping out their neighbours if they live down the street. They're not always necessarily so focused on what happens, when you have to get on a plane. We need to be speaking to people who have a broad grasp really of what the issues are, and also just believe in that broader sense of social justice and equity that branches out further. So we try to talk to people about building a portfolio of things that they support. Absolutely, their local surf club, those things are kind of essential parts of it, and we're not saying don't do that. We're just saying, make sure building a component of what you do, being a bit further afield too. But I mean, a lot of work, and what you alluded to, absolutely right, is a lot of the focus is on our compliance and making sure that everything that we do is best practice. So we have lots of training around things like child protection, inclusion, all of the kind of hot topics for governments now in terms of where they're prepared to give their money. Every government in some way or other uses their foreign aid budget as a marketing tool for themselves internationally. I mean, and that's understandable. And obviously, if they're going to give money to organizations, the risk management practices that they need to follow in that regard are huge. The whole Oxfam scandal really that started in Haiti has had a massive impact on the charity sector as a whole. And therefore, a huge amount of effort that we have to make is making sure that we're training our staff not only in how to train teachers, but in kind of how to conduct the work that they're doing to make sure that there's no chance of we're financing terrorists or any of those kind of hot topics that there are in order to secure funding from government. And Australia has quite a unique way in which it provides money to NGOs. It basically, as long as you're doing something that's identifiable as development, they're really a bit less concerned about the details of the project than they are about how you conduct the work. And I must say, I kind of really support that initiative. I mean, it's not, Australian aid's about $4 billion a year, and the amount of money that goes into this kind of pool for NGOs to access is about 3.5% of that, 140 million or so. And if you're credited to the baseline level, you get 150,000 a year. If you're accredited to a full level, you get 300,000 a year. And we've been working really hard to get from our base level accreditation to full accreditation. And we were going to apply this year, but we had one or two things, of course, with COVID that have kind of had to push that off until next year, which means we wouldn't get any money for 2 years. And I was talking to a colleague in the industry who's a relatively big NGO that people will know. And he said, yeah, it's hard. We've had to go for our reaccreditation. We had 10 people working on the paperwork for a year in order to ensure that we could get through it. So, for a small organization like ours, that's a really, really tough hurdle. But I think in principle it's a good idea. I'd probably look to address some of the components of it. But even 140 million, I mean, that's an awful lot of money. And you 300,000 for an organization like us. There's only 41 organizations accredited to get that money. So some of the big NGOs big development NGOs in Australia are getting the lion's share of that. They're getting a really substantial amount, because that then becomes based on the proportion of money you raise in Australia. So if you raise, in the case of the biggest, is in the region of 300 million that they raise. I mean, that includes the government funding, of course, but they're able that way to trounce the big proportion of that pool. But that, I'm not begrudging them that at all. I think that the way in which development is done is really important. I would argue that it goes to the quality of your programming as well as all of the other peripheral things. And I would really like to see some focus on quality of programming, because I really think that therein lies our difference. Sometimes we're criticized for not being attentive enough to the organization as itself, as opposed to what it does. We're not, I suppose Kate and I in particular, are less concerned about the longevity of the organization versus are we doing something that's really going to improve the situation for Cambodians. So. I don't know if I answered your question, Stephen.
No, you have. You've actually look. I profess that I am certainly not have any great expertise or knowledge in the competitiveness of the aid industry, if I can call it that.
Yes, absolutely.
And I didn't even know that when you said the base level and then the top level, in my mind that the jump was going to be quite substantial, and it wasn't. It was 200,000. I was like, oh wow, okay, right. And for all the work you need to do to get that return on investment, that would, I can see the challenges that come with that. Starting to wrap up here, but one of my final questions is interesting, given my background in sort of community organising, and I don't sound like I'm trying to sprig for work here, but I am interested in if your charity organisation, or if you've noticed other charity organisations have adopted or embraced community organising practices, either in Cambodia to organise, and I think you kind of are really doing community organising to some extent from what I can gather from our conversation today, organising resources at a local level and using those resources to build power to create change, the change that you want, the strategic change that you guys are seeking, or indeed doing that here in Australia or overseas, organising resources that are far more well off and getting them and mobilising them to create change, or leverage that support either here in Australia to say to the government, hey, you need to go and help this particular organisation, they're fantastic, or leveraging support in their community saying, hey, you need to go and help this organisation here in Cambodia, they're fantastic. I just want to get a sense of that. Has that been a component of the work that you do?
Well, I've kind of answered that in three different parts, really. The biggest focus, in a sense, for us in community mobilisation is something that probably we've only really come to in the last few years. The early days were when we tried to start the literacy program. I remember really clearly that one of the teachers, one of the tactics in Cambodia is to run extra classes. So you have the kids because public education is free for Cambodians in theory. So you run the class in the morning, because kids only come to class for about 3.5 hours a day. You run the class in the morning, and then you charge the children for the lessons in the afternoon. So you run over again what you were supposed to teach in the morning. You help them with any tests. You give them a good score in their tests or their ranking in the class. Cambodians are fixated on where their child ranks within the class. So you pay money and you go up the rank. Surprise, surprise. So this particular teacher did not like the fact that we were coming in and actually, suggesting different ways of teaching literacy, because she was onto a really good thing with her community, and she didn't want to have to change the way that she was doing that. Thank you very much. So she mobilized the community in a way that you would have been proud of in terms of how she managed to do that and the efficiency with which she did that. And I remember being at the school and there being a community meeting, and it was almost like sort of one of those pictures of the revolting farmers, coming with their rakes and their picks and all of those things over their shoulders. But the community came in and marched down the road, with almost dust rising as they approached, to tell us that actually they didn't need any of our help, thank you very much, and we could go and teach children to read somewhere else. Again, that's almost as big a lesson for us as that very first lesson that I spoke about being laughed at, about how, I think the surprising thing to me was that we weren't alerted to all of this by, the Cambodian staff. And I think many of the Cambodian staff were as thrown as we were by this. But we had massive consultations about how do we do this. And we really realized that one of the barriers has been that people don't really see the problem. There's not a perception in the community that their kids, should learn more at school. They just kind of accept this as being the way it's always been. And, when the kid's old enough to plough the field or to lay bricks, off they go, and it's been the job of the school is the job of the school, and we don't interfere. So a huge effort now is mobilizing the community, celebrating the work that the kids do, And because the parents don't expect the kids to read. They actually really don't expect the children to read. They don't expect them to be able to draw stuff in their books or be able to write particularly neatly. They might be able to copy some stuff down off the board, but in terms of actually writing their own stories or anything like that, no expectation. So a big part of what we're trying to do is kind of mobilize support from the community, because they're the people who can kind of police the schools and say, hang on a minute, why is my child not learning anything? Why are you sitting out there having a smoke when, all the kids are running riot inside the classroom? So, and we're a very long way from an Australian-style helicopter parent kind of approach. I mean, obviously, it's going to be a century before we get to that point. But somewhere between where Cambodia is and where perhaps some teachers lament Australia has got to, there's got to be a way in which we can work together with the communities to make things more sustainable, and for them to get involved in the responsibility of educating their kids. Because without that, again, it's a brick wall. But I think at the other end of the spectrum, we do see many charities who have been really successful at grassroots fundraising to support the work. I mean, the biggest probably help that we've had have been from teachers coming. I mean, we did for a while have teachers coming running workshops. We don't really do so much of that now, but we do have teachers now who come typically just once a year and kind of go out to the schools and observe how teaching is happening, and kind of help our staff to talk about new practices and what's going on in a more Western context, because they're genuinely interested, and it's helpful for them for their own professional development to work with teachers from overseas. They all, pretty much all of them, speak English that's way good enough to be able to cope with that. And some of the current challenges just around testing, diagnostic testing of kids, which we're trying to introduce so that we can get teachers to focus on areas of weakness, etc., are all things that second nature to Australian teachers. So when they come, it's not just us they're hearing from. They're hearing from a wider audience that this is how things are really done in successful education systems. So that kind of mobilization of those people has been helpful, and we have teachers who come back and back because they really enjoy what they're doing, and they get to know people in Cambodia. But we haven't been successful. We're just trying to do a kind of crowdfunding campaign now. We've got somebody who's doing a swim for us. The Bondi to Bronte in Sydney swim. I mean, I think you can sort of now, like many of these online things, you can swim anywhere. It doesn't have to be exactly there, and it doesn't have to be exactly on the day, but you have to swim an equivalent distance. And he's doing that, and he's been fantastic for us, helped us for a few years, and obviously he's trying to get people to sponsor him, and the money that he gets is being doubled by kind of a major name in Australian philanthropy in that sense. So for every dollar that anybody gives him, we get two, and that's been it's been really difficult to find people who are prepared to get on the bandwagon for that. But we've taken groups to come and work with us. It's a very difficult area, coming and doing volunteer work in Cambodia. But we do take groups from businesses that come, and they help restore aspects of the schools. Many of them are in very dilapidated state, and come and help repair toilet blocks and build classrooms outside for our literacy program. We have part of the literacy program is a study of healthy eating, and they help build gardens for the kids and those kind of things in the schools. So they come and, it's really good kind of team building for them. And so we have had a few businesses that come and do that. And the individuals who come on those groups typically are really helpful when we're asking, we do those kind of appeals. but yeah, it's the sort of thing that unless you kind of touched it, it's really difficult to understand what we're talking about. And if you do touch it, it's kind of, it can be life-changing, I suppose. Certainly has been for us. So,
well, it certainly sounds like it's been life-changing for you and your partner Kate. We're at our hour, so I just want to kind of wrap up, and I want to get it, but I've left thousands of questions on the table here. Maybe we need to pick this up again. But 2021, I mean, I know 2020 has been an absolute shitstorm for everyone. I'm sure it would have been the same case for you. I mean, you're stuck in a village in France right now and not in Cambodia. But what does 2021 look like for See Beyond Borders? And is also give it opportunity for a bit of a plug if anyone wants to be able to help out or get involved in the great work that you guys are doing in Cambodia.
Look, if anybody's interested, please visit the website www.SeeBeyondBorders.org, SeeBeyondBorders.org, and have a look there. There's lots of ways to get in touch and lots of details about how you can help and be involved. Come and visit, help us in Australia. Talk to other people about what we do. 2021. We've had to cut back over COVID. We are investing really significantly in this educational leaders program, and that's going to start in January. The school year has been pushed out to start 2 months later in Cambodia. It's starting then. It's going to be really new, but we're taking on probably just 6 people to start with in this thing. We had planned a good deal more. We're putting them through a university course at the same time. We've got extensive curriculum for them to do. And the other kind of key thing, as well as like the nuts and bolts on the literacy and the maths and the mentoring, another key thing is we're looking to just develop this relationship we have with building with researchers to come and research what we're calling essential questions in the education sector. If you read any of the education literacy, it's many countries are experiencing real difficulty in their education systems. It's not just Cambodia, but researchers are actually focusing on countries like Cambodia because it's kind of like a petri dish, really, of where the problems are and what they look like and kind of solutions that they can be trialing. So a lot of the work for this next year is going to be linking in researchers, university faculties with our connections at the ministry, and we're looking to try to establish some sort of virtual institute, in a sense, to share stuff more widely around these things. A big push is to say you can't simply roll out a program of solutions to thousands of teachers. You've got to build from a base of real knowledge and understanding, and hence this idea of kind of a center of excellence, if you like, where you can build outwards instead of trying to run your tanks across the landscape and think that that's going to create any change. Anybody can help with that? I'd love to hear from you, please.
Absolutely. And we'll put a link to that website that you just mentioned before, Ed, in the description for today's episode. Ed Shuttleworth from See Beyond Borders, thank you very much for taking time out of your evening to speak with us today. It's been an incredibly educational and insightful insight. It's just been amazing to just get a sense of what you guys are doing on the ground in rural Cambodia, and we wish you the best of success in 2021. I think it's fantastic work that you're doing.
Stephen, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to have somebody who listens politely in the way that you have to me going on about what I have to confess is a real passion. So thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.